D.H. Lawrence is one of the outstanding and most prolific English writers of the 20th century, author of novels like Sons and Lovers, The Rainbow, and most famously, Lady Chatterley's Lover, as well as a large collection of short stories, poetry, plays, and essays. But Lawrence is a writer with a bad reputation. First and foremost, because he dared to write about sex. When he died in 1930, Lawrence was viewed by many as little more than a pornographer. On top of this, he has often been slurred as a woman hater, as a racist, condemned as unpatriotic, and scoffed at for lacking a sense of humor and for committing every crime against the conventions of good writing. Lawrence didn't help himself. His ferocious temper, along with an unflinching appetite for speaking his mind, combined to make him plenty of enemies, especially in England, which he cursed for its snobbery and repression, and which he declared nauseates my spirit and my body. Lawrence's bad reputation, the snobbery, accusations and prejudice drove him into exile and out on a journey in pursuit of intellectual and personal freedom. A journey that reveals Lawrence to be so much bigger, more engaging and more interesting than the stereotypes would have you believe.
There isn't an essence of Lawrence, and that's his essence, you see. There's just so much of it. There's so many Lawrences. I mean, he wrote in every genre. Who else did that?
I mean, the whole bent of Lawrence is towards freedom. He that is what his writing is. It's free.
It's like watching somebody doing open heart surgery on themselves. You don't know where to look on occasions.
He's willing to struggle with confusion in broad daylight, and we always need mentors to do that for us.
Lawrence wrote his way around the globe, from the Mediterranean to Ceylon and on to Australia, ending up in the mountains of New Mexico, where for a brief period he found a kind of home. But his travels started with a journey across the Alps, an expedition that enabled him to complete his first great novel, Sons and Lovers. It's 100 years since Lawrence's working-class coming-of-age novel was published, blasting a hole in traditional fiction with its intensity and freshness. This is a film about the journey that brought that book to fruition, a soul-changing and spectacular mountain hike that reveals how the stereotypes of this writer bear only a passing resemblance to the real D.H. Lawrence. It was a journey that began on the well-to-do leafy streets of the Nottingham suburb of Mapley, as the 26-year-old David Herbert Lawrence made his way to a luncheon one Sunday in March 1912. It was an appointment that would unexpectedly and dramatically transform his life. Lawrence, who was then a school teacher, was visiting his old university lecturer, Professor Ernest Weekly. But when he arrived at the house, it wasn't the professor who greeted him at the door, but the professor's German wife, Frida.
She is not intellectual, but she knows her way around. They talk about Oedipus before lunch. Now, you don't often do this in Nottingham housewives, you really don't, you know. And she's fascinated about he's a writer as well. That's interesting. Tell me more about your writing, you know. And they develop a rapport immediately. And Lawrence finds her absolutely staggering. He has fallen for her like a ton of bricks.
Ernest Weekly was perhaps half an hour late for lunch. A minor error in timekeeping that brought about the end of his marriage and the beginning of one of the great literary love affairs. Only 2 months after their encounter in Nottingham, Lawrence and Frida travelled to Germany together, and on the 25th of May 1912 they arrived here in the small Bavarian village of Beuerberg.
You don't like when we're in love?
I was reading it a bit last night.
Writer Jeff Dyer, author of a book about his own passion and pursuit of Lawrence, and academic Catherine Brown, who specialises in Lawrence's writing, have come here at the start of a hiking expedition following the journey over the Alps that Lawrence made with Frida in the summer of 1912.
It's beautiful.
Although Lawrence had only known Frida for a few weeks, he was already convinced that she was the woman of a lifetime, and he called the week they spent here in Beuerberg a honeymoon.
Oh, you can imagine it. Quite close to a honeymoon.
Yeah.
This was where it began to look more like a honeymoon. This was the first place they had together. They had it for about a week. And this was their first place where they could properly spend a whole week together. And it was a revelation to them. And I think that that's why Frida, in her memoirs of Lawrence, actually starts the narrative at this point in Beuerberg.
Yeah, but it's, as always with Lawrence, it's it's a working honeymoon, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. If you look at the collected Lawrence, you've got about 2 shelves worth, and he died before his 45th birthday. You're thinking, how did he write that much in that time? And the answer was that even when, for example, having a honeymoon or quasi-eloping, he was writing, and Frida notes this, that he would just put himself in a corner and the words poured out.
Sure. I mean, Lawrence never dreaded writing. He could always do it. So he's writing,
That's right.
keeping up with his correspondence, he's writing. If they have any kind of experience, he'll immediately sell it into a sketch, a bit of journalism that he hopes he can sell. That'll be a poem. And then sort of hanging over him, though, is the big, major project of revising the manuscript of Paul Morell, which he'd brought with him, the manuscript which, with subsequent revisions, becomes Sons and Lovers. You do have a brisk stride.
No, I was matching you. I thought we were just saying a different pace this time.
Sons and Lovers, the novel in Lawrence's suitcase here in Beuerberg, tells the story of the family, childhood and coming of age of a young painter, Paul Morell. It's a book that closely mirrors Lawrence's own life and the story of how he became a writer. D.H. Lawrence was born into a coal mining family in the Nottinghamshire town of Eastwood in 1885. And right from early childhood, Lawrence seems to have been marked out from the crowd.
There's a photograph of Lawrence in his class at the boys' school, Albert Street. And even in that picture, he's a bit different from the others. He's the only boy of 72 with a white handkerchief in his vest pocket. He's clearly well brushed and combed, all the other kids are. He's a special child, stressed and looked after, looks a bit smaller than the others. People liked him a lot.
The young Lawrence, just like his alter ego Paul Morell in Sons and Lovers, was shaped by his intense relationships with 2 women.
His mother, people often say, school teacher. She wasn't actually a school teacher. And she married Arthur Lawrence because she thought he had a rather important job in the coal mine, mining contractor. That just means being a miner. And she thought it meant more. But from the start of the marriage, she was trying to get her boys to be different and not be either like her or her father or like their father. She wanted them to be out in the world doing professional jobs, and to hell with Eastwood mining, the grubbiness, the mining community.
The other powerful influence was Lawrence's teenage girlfriend, Jessie Chambers. Jessie was the bookish younger daughter of a farming family, and her home, Hag's Farm, which sat a couple of miles away in the country below Eastwood, was the place where Lawrence developed his passion and knowledge of the natural world. Jessie saw in Lawrence what she described as that radiant joy in being alive.
She wanted him to be a writer. I'm not sure he did so much in the early days, but here was the idea of a great man, you can be a writer. And Lawrence had this wonderful remark, a collier's son, a poet. He really had a lot of irony about that. But Jessie believed in him. I think Jessie would have helped him see himself as a tragic hero.
After finishing his studies in Nottingham in 1908, at the age of 22, Lawrence moved to the South London suburb of Croydon, where he took up a job as an elementary school teacher at the Davidson Road School. His literary career began in 1910 when a London magazine called the English Review printed one of his short stories, Odour of Chrysanthemums. Publication came about largely due to the great enthusiasm of the magazine's editor, Ford Madox Hoofer, who was struck by Lawrence's instinctive gift for storytelling, and also his compelling insight into what, for his middle-class readership, was the unknown world of working-class life. The publication of the story introduced Lawrence into the fashionable circles of London literary society, where this son of a collier and his account of the intimate lives of ordinary working people was treated with a mixture of curiosity and condescension by a cultural elite who smirked at his clothes, looks and manner. However, Hoofer was a sincere enthusiast for Lawrence's writing and helped him to get his first full-length novel, The White Peacock, into print, repeatedly declaring, "You've got genius." Towards the end of 1910, encouraged by the first hints of literary success, Lawrence began work on a new book. It would be a novel set in the mining world that so appealed to his editor and publishers, a novel about his own family and his own life, Sons and Lovers. However, the book did not come easily. Not only was this painful, emotional territory, but Lawrence was deeply frustrated by the demands that school life placed on his time and energy.
It's hard to find the time to be the writer and to do all the things which the publishing world wants of him to do, and to go on marking his essays at school and the heaps of 72 copybooks to do by the end of the evening and all that. So, what are you going to do with your life is the real problem, and he still doesn't know. But the whole problem is resolved, oddly, by Lawrence getting fearfully ill in November 1911. Gets double pneumonia, nearly dies, and struggles back into life during December, January, February, and doesn't want to go back to school teaching. And really feels that strain of the life at school, he can't go back to that. If there's ever a moment come for a break, it's come.
It was at this point that Lawrence went for lunch in Nottingham and met the extraordinary Frida Weekly, the woman who became both the central character in his life and by extension in his writing. Only 2 months later, they travelled to Germany together, although to begin with, for Frida, this was no more than a summer holiday.
Frida has every intention of going back. Of course she does. She's got 3 children. If an affair happens with Lawrence, how very nice, and she'll be back home again, after a regenerative summer. But that is not what Lawrence intends. Lawrence thinks this is the woman of a lifetime. That's his phrase for her. She is the woman of a lifetime. And he tells her she's got to marry him, not go back. Will Frida do that? It'd be crazy to do that.
But by the time they reached the little village of Boyerberg, Frida realised that Lawrence had become what she called a deep necessity. The feeling was certainly mutual. After their week of honeymooning, Lawrence and Frida continued the summer in Bavaria, with Lawrence working hard on the 3rd draft of Sons and Lovers. He submitted the manuscript to his publisher, Heinemann, but was horrified to receive a rejection letter. Although Lawrence quickly found a new publisher, thanks to his friend the editor Edward Garnett, he was keenly aware that after 2.5 years labouring on the book, he desperately needed to complete it, not least out of financial necessity. 6 months after meeting Lawrence, in August 1912, Frida agreed that instead of going back home to her husband and children in England, she would accompany him to Italy, where they hoped to find a place they could live cheaply while he settled down to his writing. The spectacular journey Lawrence and Frida undertook over the Alps, and the following months they spent in northern Italy, were life-changing for Lawrence, providing him with an extraordinary creative stimulus. Not only was he working on another draft of Sons and Lovers, but he would also produce a wealth of new writing, including groundbreaking poetry, the first of his incomparable travel sketches, a sequence of essays, 2 plays, as well as the beginning of both a comic novel and his masterpiece, The Rainbow. It would be a journey on which Lawrence came into his own as an artist. Lawrence and Frida decided to begin the journey to Italy on foot, and from Lawrence's various accounts, it's abundantly clear they were hopelessly ill-prepared for the trip.
Where are we going now, Catherine?
You getting stung?
No, it's bitten a bit. Where are we meant to be heading? Up here.
Yeah. And nor did they know. Do you think they had maps in them?
Surely they'd have had a map.
At some point on the route, they took the wrong turning, and by the time that the light began to fade, they were clearly lost.
Oh, yeah.
And then they stumbled across a small mountain chapel.
Yeah,
it's very well kept up.
Yeah, but certainly like the kind of place they...
It's clearly a functioning Catholic chapel. Shall we go in?
Yeah.
There was a click of the latch in the cold, watchful silence of the upper mountains, and we entered. By the grey darkness coming in from outside, we made out the tiny chapel, candles on the altar, and a whole covering of ex-voto pictures on the wall. Throughout this alpine journey, Lawrence wrote essays and sketches, some of which reveal an often overlooked aspect of his writing, his deep fascination and preoccupation with religion and spirituality.
I mean, this is exactly the kind of thing he was talking about. You've got a man crushed by a log. It's a ridiculous picture, and it's a kind of doggerel poem to Maria, but thanking her for the fact that he didn't die when this log landed on his belly, as it looks.
It seems to me this is so much about what's best about Lawrence. You know, you get this description of the pictures, and then you get that immediate transition into some kind of metaphysic. You know, deepest of all things among the mountain darkness was the ever-felt fear. First of all gods was the unknown God who crushed life at any moment and threatened it always. It's classic Lawrence, isn't it, that? You know, he's only been here a little while and he's already got a sense of what he thinks is the deepest experience of being up here in the mountains.
Lawrence was completely enchanted by the little chapel and thought it would make an ideal place to stop for the night. Frida had other ideas. For this daughter of a Prussian aristocrat, tramping penniless over the Alps like a vagabond was a great romantic fantasy, and to complete the picture, she insisted on sleeping in a haystack.
This is really nice, or would be if it was about 20 degrees warmer and
it was
4 hours earlier. Yeah, but I guess this is not unlike the circumstances in which Lawrence and Frida found themselves, you know, getting dark, freezing cold, hungry.
I wonder if it's got any hay inside. Oh, wow. Okay, well, there's no hay. There's logs.
Oh, it's just a load of logs.
Yeah, you couldn't sleep on that if you tried.
It's lovely, lovely, said Johanna, But alas, gentle reader, worse than fleas, worse even than mosquitoes on a sultry night, is hay. It trickles insidiously in. It trickles and tickles your face. It goes in your ears and down your neck and is around your waist. The tickling becomes an intolerable irritation, then an inflammation.
I think the chapel will be better, do you think?
Probably. I said we should have gone there.
That's right, you did, you did. No, Lawrence was right.
Young then, so
Yeah, but they did actually only walk about 11 of the 13.
After a damp, itchy night in the hay barn, Lawrence describes Riley in Mr. Noon how the following morning, freezing cold with sodden boots, like two ghosts, he and Frida stumbled back down the valley to find the road. Somewhat grumpy, both dressed in Burberry raincoats, they made the next stage of their journey through the wide Austrian valleys on a combination of omnibus and train, as they headed for what was then the small farming town of Meyerhofen.
one of the things that strikes me increasingly about Lawrence, I mean, a great genius, blah, 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 all that stuff, but Lawrence often seems to me a sort of a quite ridiculous figure.
But that was something that he was very well aware of, and he writes it into the Essays of Twilight in Italy. He was keenly aware of the ridiculousness of their situation. And certainly in person he was fun to be with. Everybody says this about him. Jesse Chambers, his first girlfriend, says it. Frida says it. He was very good at impersonating people. And he could parody himself as well.
Yeah. I find he's not very successful in the novels. I mean, I don't find him a humorous writer there.
We may have different senses of humour. I find him frequently hilarious in his novels. I mean, Mr. Noon, I laugh pretty much from beginning to end. And then in his poetry as well, there was a little wowser, John Thomas's name, and every bloomin' mortal thing, that little blight is to blame. Goes on, and it's about the male member and how it's responsible for all the troubles in the world. And that's a pure comic poem. And then sometimes you get his mimicry, his capacity as a mimic in the poems. So there's one called The Oxford Voice that ends, we are, you know we are, superior.
Meyerhofen was the end of the road. From here it was just mule tracks into the high Alps. Lawrence and Frida ended up staying here for a couple of weeks. Lawrence worked on his poems, essays and the manuscript of Sons and Lovers, and in the evenings they enjoyed drinking and dancing with the local peasant farmers. They also went on hikes into the mountains, and Lawrence, who was a keen botanist, made plant hunting expeditions,
It's amazing, isn't it?
including one particular trip into the deep, gloomy Clam Gorge that runs south of the town.
Oh my.
Gosh, it's horrifying.
Yeah.
It's a very, very tortured man.
Lawrence, brought up in the plain Puritan environment of the Methodist chapel, was alarmed and fascinated by the gruesome crucifixes that appear on every peak and bend of the mountain roads and pathways. He wrote one of his most evocative essays, describing the way the carvings of Christ change as one heads south through the Tyrolean landscape. Part travelogue and part philosophical reflection, this was the first of the many idiosyncratic travel pieces which Lawrence wrote throughout his life and which found a ready audience in newspapers and magazines. Lawrence and Frida were joined in Meyerhofen by two English friends, David Garnett, the son of his new editor, and a man called Harold Hobson.
Well, you can tell why Lawrence loved it here.
And on Wednesday the 28th of August, the small party began the 5-mile climb to the summit of the Fietscherjoch, a mountain that today straddles the border between Austria and Italy, and which would, in every sense, prove the high point of Lawrence's Alpine expedition.
God, this is stunning, transcendently beautiful. Lawrence was seeing it, something of this kind for the first time.
Oh, yeah. Well, that is something. Jeez.
And then, it was the top. Smooth as plates of iron, a flat summit, with great films of snow like silver plating on the black bronze iron, and a wind, a painful cold wind, and low in the near distance a brown shelter hut, and beyond the brow a great peak, a magnificent wedge of iron thrust into the upper air and slashed with snow slashes as if it were dazzlingly alive, so brilliant and living, the snow stripes on its aloof, dark body. For Gilbert, it was one of the perfect things of all his life, that peak, that single great sky-living blade of rock.
He clearly had an ecstatic moment on this spot looking at Italy, and he writes about it several times. I mean, he gives this moment of joy to several of his characters, and I would say that amongst prose writers, nobody describes mountains as well as Lawrence does. I mean, he's got these great terms for them, like white-fanged or striped snow panthers circling round a great camp. Thank you, Lawrence, for having come here so that we can come here too.
Something beautifully moving about it, the working class boy from Nottingham, which has been blighted by industrialism, and he comes here to this pure and wonderful place. And it's great, so there's a real sense of arrival, but also I think it's so moving because, this is the start of Lawrence's great life of global adventure, of the savage pilgrimage, as he calls it. It's just wonderful.
So, Jeff, where now?
I think,
Italy?
yeah, first up.
For Lawrence, his transcendent moment on top of this mountain, the Fitzhugh, was a point from which there was no going back. The adrenaline of travel, of looking at the world, inspired a growing sense of ambition and freedom in his writing. The poetry collection that he was working on at the time, Look, We Have Come Through, a collection whose title seems to capture that moment of emergence through the Alps, was a radical and shocking break with the poetic conventions of Edwardian England, and it provoked a reaction of prurience and snobbery in the literary circles of London.
I think a lot of his friends were appalled, and a lot of reviewers were appalled. It's the directness of utterance that's so shocking, and especially coming out of a period of Georgian poetry when everything had been, rhyming and manufactured and manicured and presented as almost sort of baroque units of thought. This wasn't that at all. It's a great big direct splurge onto the page. Lawrence is all about feeling and sensation, and I think he thought that man had become cut off from that, and it was his job, both as a poet and as David Herbert Lawrence, to reopen negotiations with the world, and finding that form of poetry, what became, I suppose, free verse, was his way of doing that. Not I, but the wind that blows through me. The fine wind is blowing the new direction of time. If only I let it bear me, carry me. If only it carry me. If only I am sensitive, subtle, oh delicate, a winged gift. I remember reading Lawrence when I was in my early 20s, and even then I thought, I don't know what to do with this stuff. It just wasn't like anything else that I was reading. It's hippie poetry. It is really wild. It's like watching somebody doing open heart surgery on themselves. You don't know where to look on occasions, and it's exciting, and it's arousing as well.
Of course, Lawrence's appetite for defying convention was not restricted to his poetry. In the years after he completed Sons and Lovers, he went on to write two revolutionary novels, The Rainbow and Women in Love. Substantial works of fiction that are both technically groundbreaking and which deal with political and sexual content that provoked one reviewer at the time to comment that The Rainbow is a greater menace to our public health than any of the epidemic diseases. The book was banned after only a few weeks in print. Women in Love took 5 years to find a publisher. It wasn't until the 1960s that Lawrence finally found popular acclaim after he was championed by the influential critic F.R. Leavis, made famous by a failed legal attempt to ban Lady Chatterley's Lover, and celebrated in one of the iconic films of the decade, Ken Russell's Women in Love. For a time, Lawrence was the pin-up of the hippie generation. But in 1970, the pendulum swung back in the other direction, when an American feminist made a furious and incisive attack on Lawrence, labeling him a misogynist. Lawrence undoubtedly had a case to answer. He made plenty of unpalatable statements about women, but his venomous outbursts are contradicted in his best writing, particularly in Women in Love and The Rainbow, where he answers his critics head-on by creating some of the most vital, liberated and fully realised female characters in literature, powerfully brought to the screen by Glenda Jackson and Jenny Linden in Ken Russell's film.
Really? You don't think one needs the experience of having been married?
Oh, Gudrun, do you really think it need be an experience?
It's bound to be, possibly undesirable, but it is bound to be an experience of some sort.
Not really. More likely to be the end of the experience.
He was a great, forward-thinking, prophetic person, and one way of looking at where he leaves his women at the end of the whole cycle of The Rainbow and Women in Love is that very much the position of the modern woman, who could be completely autonomous in, having a child, for instance. She doesn't need a man to do that necessarily. She can live on her own. Everything that people think that is suspect about Lawrence, it's merely the degree of freedom and license that he permits the female mind in the way that a woman might think about her body and about the sexual relationship with a man. He doesn't leave things at particular thresholds like other writers do. He goes all the way. He follows people into the most intimate moments of their lives. I mean, there's a lovely scene in The Rainbow where Anna, heavily pregnant Anna, fed up with her husband and wanting to annoy him and rebel against him, takes off all her clothes and dances. She knows he's going to come in, and he does, and he's horrified, he's disgusted by this spectacle of a pregnant woman with no shame. And Lawrence is right behind her. He's absolutely approving of her decision to annoy people by loving herself.
Lawrence was both enraged and deeply hurt by the censorship and rejection of his work, not least because in many ways the model for those modern liberated heroines of The Rainbow and Women in Love was his own spirited, unconventional and proudly independent wife, Frida. An independence of which he was made powerfully aware up in the Alps back in 1912. After their great climb up the Fitscherjoch, Lawrence and Frida descended to the town below, where their English walking companions took a train back home. After a couple of days' rest, Lawrence and Frida were keen to get to Italy, and they headed on south with another steep hike up a mountain called the Jaufen.
Slipping here.
I think I'm keeping up with you rather well, Jeff.
Yeah, well, you are, but of course I'm slowing down to make it easy for you.
I see.
You look to me like you're...
Can give you an assisting hand,
you're about to faint.
Late in the evening, as once again they found themselves cold, in fading light and uncertain of their location, Frida chose her moment to reveal to Lawrence that a couple of days earlier, while he was off hunting for wild flower specimens, she had had sex with their walking companion, Harold Hobson, in a hay barn.
I mean, it's really an extraordinary moment to choose. They're in some distress, they've had a very bad day, they're actually in quite considerable physical danger, and this is the moment Frida chooses to say this.
To unleash this. But yeah, it was quite a shock, and he describes it, and he writes about it later on. I mean, in about 1920, he writes about it
in Mr. Noon.
In Mr. Noon,
right.
Yeah, and writes about it in that incredible way, locating exactly what happened by saying everything turned vague.
Yeah,
he turned vaguely away. So he just enters this kind of weird stunned state, which Lawrence fixes with great precision by using that word vaguely.
He turned vaguely and went clambering up the path, while she followed in silence behind. And so they climbed for some time.
One of the things he liked about Frida is that, he couldn't walk all over her. This was a sort of early manifestation of this thing that he put such store by, that they should both be independent. It made clear that she was no pushover, which is what he wanted.
Suddenly, he turned to her. She was close behind him. He dropped her knapsack and threw his arms around her. "Never mind, my love," he said. Never mind. We do things we don't know we're doing." And he kissed her and clung to her passionately in a sudden passion of self-annihilation. Lawrence was so convinced of the importance of Frida that he was willing to self-annihilate. He needed her, whatever she did. He felt their relationship was essential to his existence and central to his writing. The journey to Italy turned out to be the beginning of a life together, a life of continual movement. After the First World War, they began a peripatetic existence in Italy, Sicily, and Sardinia, before embarking on a voyage that Lawrence referred to as a savage pilgrimage. First to what was then Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, then Australia, where they stayed for nearly 4 months and where he wrote a novel called Kangaroo. After sailing the Pacific to San Francisco, they finally drew to a halt in the high desert and mountains of New Mexico, where they stayed on and off for 3 years, and from where they made forays into Mexico. Some of Lawrence's later writing from the period when he was travelling the globe has landed him with the grim label of being both a racist and a fascist. Fascist, mostly because he wrote about fascist leaders in Kangaroo, and in a Mexican novel, The Plumed Serpent.
He is fascinated by the idea, as many people were in the 20s, of the powerful leader, the authority that really will solve these awful problems we got into with the First World War. If someone can show us a way forward that's not like that, then that's interesting. And Lawrence explores the subject. To explore something is not to be a fascist. And in 1925, when he was driven into a corner to say what he believed in politically, he said, "If I believe in anything, I believe in a good form of socialism." And that puts it straight. Lawrence is not a fascist.
It's easier to understand why Lawrence has been labelled a racist. He made rude comments about pretty much every race with which he came into contact, none more so than the English. However, these outbursts are mitigated by the openness and seriousness with which he engaged with the people and places to which he travelled. In the early 1920s, Lawrence developed a growing interest in learning from ancient pre-Christian civilizations, in particular the native Indians of America. Lawrence and Frida came to the small town of Taos in New Mexico at the invitation of a wealthy American heiress, Mabel Dodge, who lived here with her soon-to-be husband, Tony Lujan, a Native American from the nearby Taos Pueblo tribe of Indians.
Mabel Dodge Lujan, who was a wealthy heiress who had settled in Taos, whose mission was to save the Indians, had read some of his writing about nature and thought only he could capture the Indians. And so they had never met, had no contact with each other, and he said yes, he would come to Taos. He arrived here on the day of his 37th birthday in 1922, and immediately Mabel had him ride off to one of the Indian reservations, and so he was immediately immersed in the Native American culture and immediately began writing about it. He would go to the formal dances that the Indians held at their various villages, and he was transfixed by it. And in the evenings, they would go to Mabel's house, and her husband would bring in his friends, and Lawrence would dance with the Indians. He wanted to live and show people an authentic experience with nature, an authentic experience with sexuality, an authentic experience with spirituality. And it was particularly the spirituality that he hoped to get from the Taos natives.
On the 17th of May 1924, Mabel Dodge Lujan took Lawrence and Frida on an expedition up into the mountains to visit an historic Indian site, the Arroyo Seco Cave. This impressive gaping cavern gave Lawrence the idea for one of his most controversial short stories.
One of his most important and most misunderstood stories is The Woman Who Rode Away. The story is set here in this cave in northern New Mexico, which for thousands of years had been a ceremonial site for the Native Americans. Earlier in times, they had practiced rituals, possibly even of human sacrifice.
The Woman Who Rode Away is the story of the white American wife of a mine owner who gives herself to be sacrificed by a tribe of Indians. Lawrence used the exact geography here at Arroyo Seco in his story, and the ritualized killing takes place on the small ledge at the back of the cave.
She's living a dead life, pursuing silver, pursuing money, and her spirit is dead, and she decides to ride away from that life, and she willingly, without fighting, goes to her own sacrifice. Just as Lawrence dreamed of riding away from his own life, he wrote about riding off in the desert and never coming back. And he also wrote about sacrificing his heart to the sun. He could understand why somebody would want to sacrifice themselves to the sun.
The throng below gave a low, wild cry. Then the priests turned her round, so she stood with her back to the open world, her long blonde hair to the people below. Lawrence's story has enraged feminist critics who interpreted the work as an act of hatred towards women.
Many people have called it a misogynistic story because a woman is sacrificed, but it's clear in the story that the woman represents Western culture and that she is being sacrificed in order for a renewal of life for all the people. And that was Lawrence's goal from the beginning. And it was the goal of all the modernists. They sought out primitives because they felt they still had a connection with the earth that modern people had lost and that needed to be renewed.
In fact, much of Lawrence's writing about New Mexico, and indeed much of his later writing in general, with its interest in the environment, anthropology and spirituality, has been dismissed or mocked.
I think academia is getting its revenge on Lawrence the Wild Man, Lawrence the Hairy Man, Lawrence the Green Man, Lawrence the Scorner of Civilization. It's hard to say what Lawrence hated most. Did he hate class the most? Did he hate the wealthy the most? And did he hate civilization the most? And I think you could say that he hated most sophistication. He believed that humans could recover, and that's the education of the soul in nature and in gender and sexuality that you see in his books.
Lawrence and Frida stayed in Taos for 3 months before moving up into the mountains, eventually taking up the offer of a small ranch from Mabel Dodge.
The Lawrences lived here during the spring and summer of 1924 and 1925. In those days, it took a whole day on horseback to ride to and from town. So Frida and Lawrence would stay here more or less permanently and have people come in and out of town for their supplies. But they lived here frugally, and they made what they could of what animals they had around here. It offered that sense of nature that was every bit a part of Lawrence. His mind was free here, and he didn't have the problems of his everyday life that he might have elsewhere in the world. So that's why he enjoyed living here at the ranch. Lawrence often talked of the spirit of the place, and it's very much indeed present here.
Curious as it may sound, it was New Mexico that liberated me from the present era of civilization. The great era of material and mechanical development. In the magnificent, fierce morning of New Mexico, one sprang awake. A new part of the soul woke up suddenly, and the old world gave way to the new. In many ways, the wandering, the expedition that Lawrence embarked on with Frida that summer back in 1912 found its climax and a kind of conclusion here among the ponderosa pine trees at Kiowa Ranch.
It's really easy to comprehend why Lawrence would have come to New Mexico. When you come west, when you're in this big landscape, you're humbled. It's just so big and so magical. All the elements are visible. Wind, air, fire, and earth. Just when you look out across some kind of vista. And so that must have been something that he really welcomed and that he obviously responded to in a deep, deep way.
In the end, he found the sincere spirituality that he had been seeking all his life, since his early youth, a true religious connection with life, with the life forces. And he felt he found it here in New Mexico.
From New Mexico, Lawrence travelled back to Europe, where he spent most of the remaining 5 years of his life in Italy, the country where he completed his last novel, Lady Chatterley's Lover. The appeal of Italy, the climate, the cost of living, its un-Englishness, was much what it had been 14 years earlier when he arrived here with Frida in September 1912 desperate to complete that novel in his rucksack, Sons and Lovers.
Oh, oh, ha, ha. Molto piacer mi fa. Se l'ultimo mio amore fa I capricci e se ne va.
So here we are in Gargnano with this indispensable, if not entirely reliable guidebook to help us. And not only have you got the book, but I see that you've got a new dress on. You had that in your rucksack. It's self-ironing, I take it.
It was carefully packed. But this is done in honour of Frida, who, when they arrived in their first Italian town, she was looking like a tramp. She was in the dress she'd had on for all those nights in Haystacks, and she had a dark green Burberry coat and a Panama hat with a red ribbon around it, of which the colour had bled into the hat itself.
Very fetching.
But they weren't roughing it to the extent of actually carrying their luggage with them. They had their great trunks that were being sent from Bavaria, and once they arrived, then she was able to get into her party frocks and start feeling like a woman again. And I'm sure Lawrence was delighted.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the street where Lawrence and Frida would walk.
Professor Stefania Michelucci is a leading expert on Lawrence's time in Italy, and she's arranged a visit to the Villa Igia, the apartment where Lawrence and Frida stayed in Gargnano, the apartment where Sons and Lovers was finally completed.
Here, that's the first floor of the Villa Igia, where Lawrence and Frida lived. They were here for about 6 months before going back to England. There is the kitchen, the original kitchen, although many things have changed now, where one of his plays was written and set, The Fight for Barbara. Of course, many things have changed since then.
Yeah, it's difficult to somehow imagine.
And the rooms are
modern furniture.
Slightly different. But the windows and the bedroom was this one.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah. So that's where they stayed so many months, yeah? And that's the view they had from the house.
Wow. Well, that is so lovely.
God. So this is where he got Sons and Lovers polished off?
Exactly.
Wow.
I completed Sons and Lovers, his first masterpiece.
Couldn't imagine a place more different to where he was writing about. I mean, you don't get much further from a Nottinghamshire coal village than this.
Yeah, it's the exact opposite pole.
Exactly.
As far as colours are concerned, you know, light and everything.
Sitting here in the Villa Igia, looking out across Lake Garda, Lawrence took his mind back to Eastwood. The world of miners, the narrow streets of terraced houses, and the memories of his upbringing. Today, Sons and Lovers still feels surprisingly modern. 100 years ago, it was groundbreaking writing.
I mean, the two things that must strike anybody who picks up Sons and Lovers are firstly the remarkably intimate portrayal of a certain form of life that the novel gives us. And it gives us it in a documentary way. So it describes not only a way of life of the mining community, it describes the language they use, and it explains it to us. It actually glosses that life. And the second part of the novel that's very, very striking is that it tries to get inside the characters' experiences, particularly at moments when they're feeling passion, when they're feeling desire, when they're feeling most uncomfortable and uncertain about their experiences.
One of the most striking features of Sons and Lovers is its powerful insight into the minds of its female characters, an authenticity that was achieved in part thanks to Frida. From the beginning of their relationship, Frida read and became involved with Lawrence's work just as his first girlfriend, Jessie Chambers, had done. During the final reworking of Sons and Lovers, Frida helped him find a new dimension to the women in the book, and also encouraged him to take a more objective view of his story and his relationship with his mother, whose death provides the endpoint of the novel. The fourth and final version of Sons and Lovers was posted off to David Garnett, Lawrence's editor back in England, in November 1912, where it was finally published in May the following year. The book was no great commercial success, but this unusual opportunity to look in on the lives of working people was widely reviewed and put Lawrence on the literary map.
Lawrence said about Sons and Lovers, I write because I want English folk, to alter and have more sense, to have them change their view not only of the working class, but also of what passion might be, of what sexuality is. All of those things he wanted to expose people to. And that was a very startling thing, I think, for them, very challenging as well.
This is a book which divides its readers. Some people are saying this really understands women and children and marriages better than anything else we ever read. Where's this writer been hiding? And the other side is saying this is all rather distasteful. It's all about sex, and you're getting far too close to the bone, and we don't want this kind of writing, do we now?
But Sons and Lovers went on to become arguably Lawrence's most successful novel in the 20th century. Modern, democratic, highly readable, and especially popular with generations of teenagers and students. Sons and Lovers has a subdued ending. In the final pages, Paul Morell, an isolated figure, is deep in mourning for his mother. But the novel concludes with a powerful sense of a young man heading towards the light, about to embark on a new life. Looking out of their new bedroom window, Lawrence and Frida undoubtedly shared the same optimistic sense of a new beginning.
Lawrence finished Sons and Lovers and then begins to move on to the next phase of his life, and there's something really beautiful and moving and inspiring about the life he makes with Frida, living incredibly cheaply, always travelling third class, often in very, very bad health, but leading a life of incredible adventure.
In 1930, 18 years after he walked up the Weekly's garden path in Mappley, D.H. Lawrence died in France of tuberculosis at the age of only 44. Frida was at his side. Appropriately, Frida interred the remains of her wandering, nature-loving husband up here at their ranch in New Mexico, the place where she herself was buried 26 years later. Lawrence's own symbol of the phoenix perches optimistically on top of the small chapel. But the remoteness and inaccessibility of Lawrence's memorial up at the Kiowa Ranch can't help but seem symbolic of his continued status as an outsider. Today, many universities no longer teach the apparently politically incorrect D.H. Lawrence. And Sons and Lovers has long ceased to be a must-read book for every teenager.
The thing that sort of saddens me about Lawrence is that he suffered so much abuse when he was alive, and the fact that he continues to suffer it seems very harsh, that justice hasn't been done. He, to my mind, is probably the greatest writer of English prose.
The Academy has gotten its revenge on Lawrence. They have peripheralized him. And if you peripheralize even a major artist long enough, they will vanish into the mists. They will be dropped from the collective memory. And it could happen to Lawrence. It's hard to tell.
Lawrence has always been divisive. It's hard to think of a writer who has been loved and loathed in such equal measure. But today perhaps the balance is shifting against him, and his bad reputation, much of which seems undeserved, is in danger of obscuring one of the most original, vital and provocative voices in the language.
He'd written his books in the way that he intended to. He'd seen it through, and it had cost him dear. You know, he was exiled, he was ridiculed, he was persecuted. I mean, even at the time of his death, he was still seen by some as a kind of meddling pornographer, really. But he was true to himself. I think that's what Lawrence is about. He was true to himself. You know, how many of us can say that as writers?
It's very easy to dismiss any of his statements, any of his ideas on politics, on men, on women, on the human body, on the relationship between love and lust. And he would say, fine, disagree. You just do some searching for yourself. You work out what's actually going on. And this is what I find really inspiring in him. It's not the case that I agree with any one of his statements, but I do think that whilst we're alive, during our years on earth, we might as well do some living and actually make the spiritual effort to work out what's going on. And that's what Lawrence is an example of. That's what he inspires me to do. He was so alive.
I would say he was pro-life, not in the political sense, but in the sense that he loved life. He made you want to be alive.